Hello, Michael here. Lately we've been capturing video of our podcast interviews for you, but in this case I'm afraid it was not possible and we only have the audio version available. Hope you enjoy this chat with Caroline Nicolay and Tom Timbrell all the same. They've got a wealth of information to share and their perspective on the Iron Age and domestic lives in prehistory is totally unique. I'm Michael Bott.
And I'm Rupert Soskin. Welcome to another Prehistory Guys interview, bringing you different perspectives on the distant past.
Yes, and we're breaking the mould a bit today because, brace yourselves, our guests today are experts in all manner of daily life from the Iron Age onwards.
Shocker, isn't it? Michael and I came round to thinking that there is so much knowledge to be gleaned from the Iron Age that can shed light onto aspects of the Bronze Age and the Neolithic. So what better than to talk to people who spend their lives educating people about our Iron Age ancestors' daily existence?
We should say that Caroline Nicolay and Tom Timbrell do work on all ages of history, but the Iron Age is their particular area of expertise. They work together as a team, recreating all the aspects of daily life in the distant past, putting on demonstrations of authentic catering, crafts like creating paints and pigments, blacksmithing and metalworking.
It's fantastic that the raw materials they work with for paints and pigments go all the way from prehistoric cave paintings to Roman frescoes.
And apart from the public demonstrations, Tom also reproduces historical metalwork like knives and swords using the exact techniques available at the time.
There's so much to talk about. Should we get them in then?
I think we better had. Welcome, Caroline. Welcome, Tom. Welcome to the Prehistory Guys
very
podcast.
Good to have you here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How are you down in Dorset as you are?
Tom, after you.
Aye, we're doing lovely, we are. It's all fun in this isolation,
Yeah.
I've got to say. But of course, hey, that's how it is. But other than that, yeah, it's lovely. We're having a hearty mix of rain and sunshine down here, so it's good.
Yeah, are you actually preparing for any great things when lockdown is lifted?
Hopefully Christmas markets.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Well, do you know what? Let's just dig in, because the one thing that we always ask, first question up that we ask everybody is, what got you into what you do? So whether it's your individual disciplines or the fact that you focus, your real preference is Iron Age related stuff, even though you do a lot on either side. But yeah, tell us about that. What how did you come to be where you are?
Well, for myself, I was studying history at the University of Leicester. And all the while doing that, I was actually quite desperate to study earlier periods, but the furthest back we went was about 7th century Anglo-Saxon England.
Right.
I really wanted to go further back than that. Fortunately, when I left university, I met a reenactment group who did the Iron Age and Roman Britain. It was also at the time that I was training to be a blacksmith. So fortunately, those two kind of went together, the Iron Age and blacksmithing. And that like of history for me, along with the practical crafts, slowly bloomed into something more. I started doing historic demonstrations at a Tudor living history site.
Well, not far from me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just in Stratford-upon-Avon. Yeah. So getting to do that while I was still learning blacksmithing, learning additional history around it, the role of the blacksmith in communities, and frankly, it just all goes together really well. And I can get a bit obsessive when I'm researching something, so it just spirals and spirals and spirals into more and more, which is quite fun.
Yeah. Excellent. How about you, Caroline?
A little bit differently, I have to say, because I didn't really, very strangely, from France, I didn't really study or hear about the Iron Age before university. So I studied biology and then switched over completely to ancient history, archaeology and art history.
Okay, that's quite a leap.
It was a terrible year in biology. So we changed. So it was definitely archaeology and antiquity, prehistory, ancient worlds, as they call them. And suddenly we had a professor teaching us about the local Iron Age out of the blue, and that was an incredible revelation for me. It was everything I've always been looking for, if you like. So the art was sort of Viking-y, Saxony, this type of northwestern Europe and Scandinavian. But even the early Hallstatt and the Latele art was really exactly what I was interested in. Then, following a little bit on that, I read a few books, fortunately, and kept being told and remembering my very early teachers telling us that during prehistory, everybody was eating porridge and blandgul, and that was it. So putting these two courses together, it just didn't add. And I was really interested, not so much in the dates, unfortunately, but really into the archaeology of normal life, of normal people, with the usual questions: what do they eat, what do they wear, what do they look like, and where do they go to the toilets? That's always what we got.
Yeah.
These are the questions that need to be answered.
Do. So I started like that, arrived in England in 2014 actually.
Okay.
For an internship in the Roman Baths Museum in Bath. Met a reenactment group that was doing Romans and Britons.
Okay.
Met a young blacksmith there.
Oh, right.
And after so many adventures and fights, we ended up working on the same Tudor farm. So
Brilliant.
he brought me back from France to work on the Tudor farm, and I've never left England. And decided to stay as usual. Really, the maid ended up with a blacksmith. And
That's how I operate, for sure.
No, well, it's a combination that seems to be working. I mean, we've sort of broadly painted a very broad, loose picture of what you do. But how would you describe what you do together and separately, for that matter?
We usually call ourselves living historians. I mean, doing living history or period interpreters. It's a very good question because there's not a very specific word for that kind of job, of profession. Whereas in France, we call them cultural mediators instead of interpreters.
Okay.
Though they don't all do living history. So it's a very complicated question. We translate very in-depth archaeological and historical research into visually attractive and interactive displays for the public. That's usually how I explain it.
No, living history is a good description. I think people will grasp it from those two words better than our introduction probably.
It was a very good introduction, I have to say.
It is. No, the thing is that, I mean, just from chatting to you with you before, there's just so much that we could chat about, and there are. I mean, some of the interesting things. We're going to talk about all these things, but one of the things that I particularly liked that I'd love you to talk about is the fact that, because we often ignore these little details when we're thinking about the past, and even like you make a comment of where do they go to the toilet, because we just everybody glosses over these things. You read a book, is it in there? No, it isn't. And one of the comments that you made when we were chatting previously was no waste.
Yes.
And that is it's such a huge one of the things that we've got wrong in modern society. So tell us a bit about your understanding of that aspect of daily life.
Sure. It's a very interesting one, I find, because it actually could provide answers to modern problems. The waste problem really in the 21st century is a big one, and it's mainly happening because of the introduction of plastic. And I would have said industrialization, but maybe not. And that's something that didn't happen even in my grandparents' time, and I'm not that old. So that's a very recent problem. Waste of food as well. That's kind of the same. But when we talk about waste, we tend to explain it through our specific personal displays. I work mainly on food and paints and pigments, for example. Yeah. And Tom, being a blacksmith, usually present Iron Age up to any time period, blacksmithing, forging, metalwork, and things like that. And there is no waste either in crafts. So what we started doing this year is actually presenting Iron Age hunting. So Tom does that. And we show people not just how to butcher an animal, but also butcher and cook, but also how to use the skin, how to make rawhide or leather, how you use sinew and the tendons to make cordage, how you can use hooves and other parts to make hide glue that we can then use with the rawhide on our replica shields, and so on and so forth. And that's something that we really find important, that through our history, if ever you have any kind of material, in fact, both for crafts or for food or even storage, you reuse it. You are incredibly inventive. I was just reading a document yesterday for a site in Gaul, an oppidum, Bibracte, which is where Caesar decided to camp for the winter. Anyway, at some point. And they have an incredible mass. They have tons of amphorae and broken imported pottery. They don't throw them away. It's not in a pit or anything like that. They turn it into roads. They use it to pave the place, or they turn it to build buildings on top of it. So that's that kind of idea.
How did you find yourself learning the disciplines of no waste, of extrapolating, what the systems were to make sure that there's no waste? For example, when you're deciding what to do with the parts of a butchered animal, did you learn that from a book, or does it come from practice?
I would say it comes from both. I mean, when you're researching initially, before we take up a particular craft or display anyway, we generally do end up researching about it before. And you will find that, well, certainly a lot of the people who have written texts or analysis of, say, the Iron Age, of course, they grew up in, like our grandparents, not wasting anything. Some of them may have even had a case where they had pigs still in their yard as a waste disposal unit, and when you start taking that into the context of Iron Age tribes and even tribes today in some of the more remote areas of the world, where if you look at a pig, we might see it just as an animal that we can throw scraps to, but you've got to bear in mind a pig can turn almost any piece of scrap or rubbish into protein and food for you. So even though you can't eat it, they can, and it eventually translate into food for you. And then from that pig, what else are you going to get? So it's we might make myself for the hunting displays, and after butchering the animal, I'm researching whether leg bones of sheep are being used as gouges for woodwork or as spearheads for hunting, which is currently for me it's the winning argument. But also they're being turned into awls for leatherwork. You've got everything you need in there, and maybe even weaving combs. And so now we're trying to attach sheep bone spearheads onto a wooden shaft. So how do we do that? Do we drill a pin and put a pin of wood through? Do we bind it with sinew from the animal's tendons? What are we doing? Can we get everything we need for the next step from that animal, from what we're using?
One of the things that I think is for me anyway is an interesting extension of what you've just been talking about. From the point of view of this being daily life, is your understanding that every household would be doing this, or that people within a household would have a load of this left over that they would take to so-and-so next door because they're good at using, whatever. Do you see what I mean? Is it something...
Yes.
Did everybody do this, or did people share the disciplines around?
Once again, we can only base ourselves on archaeological remains and comparison with ethnoarchaeology or what is said from Roman or Greek or Roman texts.
Sure.
It appeared that during the Iron Age, and we study mainly the second half of the Iron Age, it's a very specialized society. On some hill forts or on some sites, you will find an awful lot of, say, sheep bones. And it sometimes begins to be explained by the fact that you have all the farms around there. You would bring your sheep, they are butchered on a specific part of the site. On the other side of the site, you usually have the artisans' quarters. So depending on the type of finds and what you have all around, you might see clearly in the assemblages. I love using these words.
Yes.
It's so clever. You might see in the assemblages that people are specialists. I usually see Iron Age society and probably earlier societies as well, as somebody once told me, which is always remember if somebody had the time to build Stonehenge, somebody else was at home trying to prepare food, keep the house tidy, look after the animals and the fields. And that's true. There are extremely specialized craft, or there are people who are working in different areas. Say agriculture. A lot of people would work in agriculture. A lot of people ask, but warrior classes? Yes, there were definitely some specialists. And you have armed peasantry as well on the side. For the craft, it's actually, that's a good question for Tom, because the vision of iron working in the Iron Age as a very new material is sometimes described as a very revered and specialist craft, and by some other authors, a very low class, quite new, not really understood type of craft as well. So
with blacksmithing and metalworking in Britain. I mean, when we're talking about specialization, what I sometimes find interesting is that you have some sites where they are actually making artifacts from iron, but all they're doing on that site is making them. Someone else in another village, so many miles down the way, is doing the smelting. Yes. They're not something where we think, a blacksmith would smelt his own metal and then forge it. In some cases, that is what's happening. But there is also clear divides where there is, the names slip me because I always forget these two names, two hill forts in Wales. One where they're producing vast amounts of iron billets, or they're smelting lots of iron. But they're working relatively little. The complexes that have been found suggest small amount of actual metal working into artifacts.
Interesting.
But about 20 miles away, there's another hill fort where they're smelting virtually no iron, but they are just working iron artifacts out and making items. And it shows a huge complex of blacksmiths, and the amount of scale and remains from metalworking we find is quite large. So there is that level of specialization. Then also we have to ask about, was blacksmithing done by absolute experts, people who absolutely knew what they were doing? And in some instances, yes, there's items like the Kirkburn sword that shows that whoever made that was an absolute master and expert and specialist in what they were doing. And then there's various items like what's affectionately sometimes called the bean tin or coffee can, a metal container on an iron chain with some of the worst engraving you've ever seen in it.
It is terrible.
You compare it to the Iron Age artwork across Britain, and out of all of it, this is some of the shoddiest work done. But is this someone learning? Is it the son of someone who was trying and proudly brought it to them to say, look what I did, And it was their apprentice piece. there's iron swords that show that they knew exactly what they were doing, or at least had a very good grasp of hardening and tempering. And then there's iron swords that show they're just metal bars with the edges hammered sharp and stuck on a ram's horn.
Fascinating. That's a really interesting point, because we did an interview with Professor Duncan Garrow not so long ago. And his work on grave goods reveals that, of course, as archaeologists, they have been initially attracted to the bling, the good stuff, the stuff that stands out. And he, with the project he's doing at the moment, has been painstakingly going back and going through the other stuff that's been left in burials, the ordinary, the day-to-day stuff. And so that what you just said reminded me of that the good stuff rises to the surface, but also we've got huge stories about the levels.
There's an interesting aspect of transition as well, isn't there? That if you go back to the Bronze Age, and the metal worker was probably almost a magician, that suddenly people are making metals from, how do you turn rock, these people can turn rock into metal. And then, you shift 1,000 years or more and everybody understands how, what it's about. That, the status would obviously shift from being someone who was almost an alchemist to someone who, however skilled, was, it was just another skill. It's interesting. I find it fascinating how people's status in society can just change over time.
So off the back of what you're saying, Rupert, I will ask Tom to recount his story, the first attempt at a sword.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, good one.
Oh, yes, the sword. That was a fun project to do during a week-long display at Chalk Valley History Festival. And I think it was about 3 years ago now, actually. And I'd made some modern swords before using a nice fan-fueled forges and nice grinders to help me finish off shapes and so on and so forth. But being a little bit stuck of what to do for the demonstration, I didn't want to just keep making the bog standard nails, spearheads and things. I wanted to work on something over the week. And it's been a little theory of mine, wondering how actually expensive swords were in the Iron Age. As I said, some are undoubtedly for lords, incredibly expensive, with inlaid coral from the coasts of Italy in the handles. In a sword in Yorkshire, the Kirkburn sword.
Flipping heck.
There's ones like that, and then, as I said, there's ones found where they are just hammered billets of iron with sharp edges stuck on a ram's horn. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to test this theory out. How quickly, with basic equipment, could I make a sword? And bearing in mind, I was having to explain to people and stop and chat to them all week long. It took me only 3 days of fairly laid-back work, I've got to say, on a hand-pumped charcoal forge using an iron hammer, an iron billet, and a small 2-inch square iron anvil. And over 3 days, I forged out just a 2-inch square.
Wow.
And out of over 3 days, I forged out a fully functioning iron sword, which we then tested. It wasn't quenched, it wasn't tempered, it was just forged out, and then while cold, the edges were hammered to harden them and make them sharpened up with a whetstone. We put a simple wooden handle on it, had a deer carcass on a wooden pel, and we did that did the cut test in front of about 200 to 500 people, and when we cut through and the crowd goes silent at how lethal the shot was, you've done a good sword, you've made it right. And that within that sword, I had to say that there was no specialist knowledge, there was no fire welding, there was nothing that someone who's seen it done before, who has seen someone forging, you can figure that out yourself. You heat up the metal and hit it, and try and hit it into the rough shape of a sword, which isn't that complex. And 3 days, simple tools, simple theory and knowledge, we had a working sword.
That is really interesting. So okay, taking that example where you say that was laid back work and you were doing other things at the same time. If you were under pressure and somebody said, "Make me a sword now," how long would it take you?
With those same bits of equipment and with the evidence of iron currency bars being traded in Britain, if you could somehow purchase one of those, and we know certainly people were producing lots of grain and there was wealth in Britain, so potentially a farmer could, in essence, have traded his extra grain for an iron billet. I think I could easily do that in a day, if that.
Wow.
I mean, I would have to work hard, but I'm not against that.
But the point is, you've got a simple thing that's been made in a day that is lethal and effective. Yeah, that's a kind of magic.
It is absolutely
it
kind
is
of magic.
extraordinary.
So when you talk about an iron billet, tell our listeners, describe an iron billet. How big is it?
So they vary. Some can be only about a foot long. There are examples found from, I think, Danebury Hill Fort, and you can see them in the Andover Museum of Iron Age History and the likes, that are essentially full sword length. Some are longer, some are shorter. And in Britain, there's a multitude of examples where they are just flat bars there, and one end of it might be pointed. The other end could be forged into a rough socket, folded over and welded onto the main section. All of these, there's a language going on there saying that this is good quality iron. This iron is good for welding. This iron's good for making sockets.
Okay.
Don't get me wrong. When I did this sword, and we was partly, the whole test was to see, would it bend like Roman writers talk about the Celtic swords bending and the warrior having to retire from battle to stamp his blade flat and then rejoin the fray. And yeah, that iron sword did bend. It took a bit. Sometimes it bent a lot. Other times we've tested it. It was a marginal bend and you could still fight with it. And straightening it out, I just dropped it to the floor, stamped on it quickly, picked it back up, and I was ready to go again.
Wow.
But it was that still very effective weapon. And yeah, the billets we get, the Iron Age currency bars, you could get one that means you have a lot of work to do, or you could potentially get one that means you just have to hit edges onto it and sharpen it with a whetstone.
Yeah.
Right.
I think we're fascinated by the idea of currency bars, and it's a subject we could chase down quite a long rabbit hole. I think perhaps we should sort of save that until later on. Perhaps
absolutely, that can be almost
time.
endless. That can.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
that's my fear.
It applies to so many things, doesn't it? You know, the method of exchange and what was the perceived value of anything. You know, I mean, in the work that you do, Caroline, I'm interested that, you know, when you talk about pigments and paints, that, you know, if you wanted any fancy kind of clothes that I'm pretty sure wouldn't be being made in every single household, you know, what are the sort of costs involved in something that actually requires careful, painstaking dyeing, maybe,
and
or weaving with different colours. You know, it's an extremely complex thing that we take utterly for granted today.
Oh yeah.
And what is perceived as having a high value?
That's a very good question, which unfortunately doesn't have many answers, I'm afraid. Because there's a lot of research on ancient textiles, not just for the Iron Age, but as we're talking about our favorite time period, there's for example, I'm working currently on a replica outfit from 350 BC from the Huldromose woman that has been found in Denmark. Wow. And it's an incredible find because the bog body was fully clothed. So it's a 40-plus years old woman, no shoes on, and she had a, now proven, there are no doubts anymore. She had an undergarment made out of plant fibers, so it could be nettles, flax, or linen, at least down to her thighs, at least that. On top of that, she had a skirt which breaks the usual vision of the the tube dress, the peplos type of dress, with two brooches on the shoulders. She had a very wide skirt that was gathered at the top, at the waist, by a woven band, including a drawstring made out of leather. That very band was woven in the fabric. So the fabric was started by a very specific tablet woven or something else weave, then continued as a fabric woven on a tubular loom, on a circle loom.
Wow.
So you have a lot of material there. On top, she had a scarf as well, with a bone pin under the left arm to close it. And on top of that, not one but two capes made out of sheepskin. The closest to the body one was with the wool turned inwards, and the outer one with the wool turned outwards. So you have 2 layers of 11 to 16 sheepskins each. And she had a necklace, very simple, with 2 tiny ember beads on a woolen string. And no shoes on. Nothing really said about the hair that I can recall, but that has been described as potentially quite an expensive, a posh garment. And I don't see it like that at all, unfortunately. I think it impresses us an awful lot when we see that, because it's extremely rare to get clothing from such early time periods. And I bet Must Farm, for the very late Bronze Age, will be incredibly interesting and will bring us so many more.
I think we've talked about it enough times, so I think our listeners all know about Must Farm. But they, they're calling it Britain's Pompeii over in Peterborough. Because they found fabric on the loom, didn't they, at Must Farm?
And they found such fine threads on bobbins or in balls of yarn, and that's the most. To me, that's one of the most incredible finds in Must Farm. It's, apart from the wheel that pushes back the date of the first wheel in Britain, that's and the food in the pot with a spoon in it,
yes,
and the flint quernstone that I don't know enough about. Everything is amazing, honestly, at Must Farm. But the thread is, and I'm hoping there will be soon, or there might be already, and I don't know about it, but analysis on any textiles they may find to see if they were dyed or not. Because Must Farm is just at the limit between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And normally the commonly agreed idea is that in the Bronze Age we don't dye our clothes, whereas in the Iron Age there's a great revolution in colour, and everybody loves deeply, very brightly coloured, garishly coloured fabrics, which begins to date by quite some time. At least the Earldremo's women, and all the clothes are dyed and re-dyed, so over-dyed because they were used for so long and washed so many times, they faded, so they re-dyed it with one single colour, with luteolin, so a form of yellow. But yes, to go back to the waist idea, this Iron Age, mid-Iron Age outfits has been repaired so many times. There's so many patches of different types of leather on the capes, for example, that it just makes it not new. But this new article, I think it has been published. Okay, it might be 10 years ago.
Okay.
We are in 2020.
Time goes quickly.
Yes, we are.
It's one of the very recent ones. They suddenly analysed the textiles and the lady. It's a strontium analysis.
That's right.
Right, to have a look at the provenance of such things. And interestingly enough, and very surprisingly, the woman herself and the plant fibers undergarments seems to come from some way away, because that has been found, I think, in Jutland, but in Denmark. And the only Precambrian environment that they can find around would be Norway, Sweden, or islands in the Baltic Sea.
Okay.
So the lady is not that local. The undergarment seems to come from the same place, yet the woolen scarf is definitely local.
Right.
Wow.
And it's these parts of daily life we'll never really know. She repaired all her garments, or somebody did. She happened to die there, but was she traveling?
Yeah.
Was she actually living here? Did she just arrive from, say, Norway, went to a market around here, bought a scarf, and 2 weeks later died and had no family around, so was deposited in a grave in the bog?
Yeah.
We'll never know.
This the extraordinary thing, that a strontium analysis that gives us this recurring story of people being buried not in the place they came from, of mobility, of people travelling long distances. You know,
Really
we hear
is.
tales, you know, not so long ago, maybe even current, that people that, you know, haven't left their village in 80
Yeah.
years,
That's
and
true.
yet there's these burials of people
Yeah.
from back then being revealed to be
there's an
travellers,
old
the
boy
great
in a
travellers.
village not far from me, actually, who is in his 90s, and
Yeah.
he has never been outside his village. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Someone else has always gone and done his shopping and all that kind of stuff. It's
Yeah.
amazing, isn't it? And then you go back thousands of years and people would, you know, it's
Yes,
the same, isn't
absolutely.
it? Some people travelled, some people didn't. I'm fascinated in this aspect of repair, though, because not just with fabrics, but Tom, also with metals as well. You know,
Yeah.
if anything required a significant amount of time, effort, and cost to produce, then obviously, you know, it was not like today. They would have repaired it. They wouldn't have thrown it away. So it's an interesting thing, I think, where you might have something that, you know, where's that tipping point where something that was so valuable in itself, but it is no longer worth repair?
That's
That's
always
for you, that's for the bronze.
Well, well, this is the interesting thing. I mean, with iron, it can be fairly simple, well, relatively simple to repair it. At Danebury Hillfort, for example, there is a saw that has snapped in half, and it's found alongside another saw which is pristine and wonderful. A similar saw found next to it, snapped in half, and someone has fire welded the two halves back together in light. Now, the debate is, does that saw still work? Because in theory, you now have one blade offset from the other.
Yeah.
With a little bit of work, I wouldn't be surprised if you could then, it could have been reworked, and it might have worked perfectly fine afterwards. It could have just been someone learning fire welding, and hey, here's two pieces of scrap, see if you can put them back together, who knows. I've always said that throughout learning blacksmithing and doing my displays, I've always said that blacksmiths were one of the ultimate recyclers, because, for instance, if you have something like a scythe and that snaps, you don't have a broken scythe, you have now two pieces of metal that can be turned into billhooks. And then those pieces can be turned into small knives, and then those pieces can be turned into nails, and then if all else fails, you can take those nails, drop them in a furnace, smelt them all back together, and you've got a bloom of iron again, and you start all over again. You do lose some of the metal over time. I mean, I'd like to say it's an infinite process, but you will lose over time material into slag and that. But what's great is slag can be put back into bloomeries, and in fact, post, I think, early Industrial Revolution, they were actually taking known Roman, Iron Age and Saxon slag deposits and dropping them back into furnaces, because the original processes had been so inefficient. There was still about 36% plus iron in the slag. And so they were just taking the already kind of reduced slag, dropping it back into the furnace and extracting iron from that instead of excavating more ore. And doing it that way. So that recycling can almost go on indefinitely, I would say. At what point does something become unusable? It's hard to tell. As a historic cutler, I have examples of knives from the 17th century where the knife is definitely, it started life as an eating knife. It has all the same characteristics as the eating knife, same shapes post 1650 drop in the tip so that you can't easily stab anyone anymore, because that becomes the fashion to have drop tip knives again, or rounded tip knives. The handle, just as you would expect it to be an eating knife. The only crux is this knife in its entirety, blade and handle, is only 8 centimeters long.
Okay.
So that's
It has broken, the tip shows it has snapped, it's been reworked down and down and down until you have a blade 4 centimeters
inches?
long. No, 4 centimeters long.
Yeah.
And a handle 4 centimeters long. And it's a tiny knife.
Just yeah.
They think it was used for skiving leather, for skimming the edge off a piece of leather while working it. But undoubtedly, it was bigger at some point, and it's still got the same shapes as an eating knife. Maybe they gave it to a child to use as a practice eating knife. You know, and we can find those exact same things. Iron Age knives, we have plenty of examples. It may have been because they've rotted away or degraded in the ground. But we have plenty of examples of worn iron knives that are almost to a nub. Ötzi has a flint knife that has worn almost to a nub, and in his backpack I think he has the components of a knife he was making to replace the old one.
Yeah.
Oh, bless.
And he has
He's
tool
using
to
it and
retouch
using
it,
it until it's nothing.
Yeah.
It's a valuable piece. It's got worth still. I think most people, if they have a penknife that wears down that far, they chuck it. But
Yeah.
it's
Isn't it
when-
amazing how that simple question of waste reveals so much?
Yeah.
It's
My
at
goodness.
the heart of every craft and daily life in
Yeah.
anywhere. It's such an important thing, and the problem is, for me, I struggle to see it as people see it in the 21st century, because I haven't been brought up like that.
Yeah.
I have been taught by my parents since I'm born that you eat everything what is not eaten, then will be eaten the next day, and you transform every dish into something new every other day. We try to repair every kind of cloth, and it wasn't for lack of money, it's just the way people lived, or my parents have been taught by my grandparents, and throughout the world wars, etc. In Eastern France, we still are pretty rural communities.
You want to come
So
down
it's-
here?
Well, but that's the things that are so interesting, and people go back to it. It has been one, maybe 2 generations, and that's it. We're going back to less plastic, more recycling, more repairing things, and growing food locally, and all that. It has been the case for thousands of years, and within 2 generations in the 21st century, we understand it's not the right way.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I take it, in a
fascinating.
can I take it in a slightly different direction?
Sure.
Now, Caroline, I just want to ask you that on your website, it says about you giving talks or demonstrating or teaching how the study of pollens and seeds and bones, etc., by archaeologists, how you use that information to recreate the cooking techniques that you've developed and understood. You know how that information has come out of the ground, how you translate that raw data kind of information into the techniques that you use.
What I find great is that you can almost taste archaeology. So I didn't invent it, I have to admit. But it's the process that I like to explain, from the dig to the plate.
Yeah.
Without archaeology, without these datas, very specific one on pollens, on osteology, so bones remains, carpology for the seeds, even dendrochronology, but the paleo environment in general, and then residue analysis on cooking pots, for example. All of these are the most important data I can ever get. Except if you go to Must Farm and you find a pot with the food still in it. This is just this is the absolute best. But we don't have texts. We don't have apicius recipes for the Iron Age and earlier time periods. If you don't base yourself on these datas, you won't have access to a non-exhaustive, in any case, but a list of potential ingredients. From there on, you have to work with archaeology again, but about the ceramic, about the metalwork and all these sort of things, everything that could be or is a utensil. For example, in the Iron Age, both in Gaul and in Britain, there are no, not that I know of, there are no frying pans. It's a technology, it's an item that arrives with the legionaries with a folding frying pan in their backpack. It's not a way we eat. We don't fry things. So unfortunately, I can't make Iron Age pancakes. That's traumatic for me, trust me.
Interesting, isn't it? You just would never think of things like that. Okay.
Yeah,
So you can make things on a flat hot stone. You can bake. You can cook a stew in raw deer skin. So you can butcher an animal, use the skin as a cauldron, suspend it from a fire, and by the beautiful law of physics and and how the words work, it works. You can cook with hot stones, and we have so many examples of different techniques that I unfortunately didn't have the pleasure to experiment with enough. And it's all of that you have to take into account to eventually explain to people that no, we don't eat wild boar roasted on a fire pit like in Asterix all the time. That's what I get in France a lot. But and the food wasn't bland, it wasn't samey. There's a difference between surviving and going through, not the winter, but springtime. Early spring is the completed time period. And just living life.
Yeah.
Humans will make themselves comfortable. Any time period, anywhere around the world. Why would you have developed agriculture if it was to eat bland porridge every day of your life? It doesn't make sense. Unfortunately, archaeology now, with the new ways of gathering datas and the analysis that are mind-blowing to me, you can get so many information. Unfortunately, I will never ever be able to tell you this is exactly what it tasted like in the Iron Age. No chance. Even with the mustard discovery, we could make the exact same recipe, but the ingredients that we will get now have grown in conditions that are not the same ones. They will never be the same again. But we can get close. It's not the point to taste exactly the same, even if it was 100% exactly the same as what this person was cooking on that day at Must Farm. We don't have the cultural background and the sensitive and the brain memory, the experience memory of a meal that you can experience from a meal. So I do all that for no reason, really.
Well, when two people standing in the same kitchen with the same recipe produce something, you can guarantee it's going to be entirely different. So I think it'd be a tall order to expect.
It's so true, isn't it? It's
That's
so true.
very true.
Actually, do you know something? Talking about food, something that I also want to talk about, which was quite a surprise to us, was the low percentages of meat from hunting.
Yes.
That you talked about, because this a bit of a revelation to us when we were chatting before, that this fundamental cultural change from Neolithic and Bronze Age into the Iron Age. So tell us about what you know about the sort of meat that they were eating.
According to my 5 minutes research just before then, no, we gathered the precise numbers because I really wanted to give you numbers that I've read in archaeological publications. So for Danebury Hillfort, for example, we also have Glastonbury, we have the Fiskerton Causeway, we have many different remains. And Tom will explain much better than me what the difference between hunting and agriculture is. But in essence, for the non-hunted animal, for the how do you call them? Domestic. That's it. For the domestic animals, in England, on average, you usually have sheep first. Sheep and goat, they're very complicated to separate. And in Danebury Hillfort, you have 61% of sheep bones from butchered bones, 20% cattle, 11% pig, then 3% horse and dog that have both butchery marks on their bones.
Okay.
And then, so we eat horse, we eat dog, and then there's 2% that are other species and wild species. There's very
2%.
little hunting.
Wow.
Usually around, say, 5% of the meat would be hunted, except if you live in an environment that is favorable to more hunting, less agriculture and pasture land.
Yeah.
It's quite surprising, really, those differences. We always, as Caroline was saying, think of the Britons or the Celts eating wild boar every night and so on and so forth, and that being the main source of food. But what people need to realise is that farming, agriculture, it's interdependent relationship between the animals and the crops that you're growing.
Yeah.
And they did make use of every scrap of resource, every way they could exploit it. So once you've harvested in your barley or whatnot, and you've got your stubble out there, you send out your cattle first, followed by your sheep, and then followed by your pigs in the autumn. And you've got 3 animals worth of manure going into the ground to help you when you grow your next batch of crops. And even in places like Glastonbury and Glastonbury Lake Village and Mere Lake Village, where hunting is higher than normal. As Caroline was saying, it's about 2 to 5% roughly across Britain is your hunted animals that are providing you meat. And the rest is domesticated animals. Even in Glastonbury, where that percentage creeps up, you've still got vast quantities of sheep being grazed and reared, and about 88% of the bones there of the domesticated animals are sheep. Still vast numbers. You do have as well dog and horse and some cattle as well, and even for the hunted animals, it's not boar. There may be an occasion where it's boar or something, but even then it's hard to tell between the bones of a wild boar and a large domesticated pig.
Indeed.
What's quite surprising, it was quite surprising to me at least, it's birds.
Okay.
Glastonbury, there's over 30 birds, different types of birds identified within the bone heaps.
Oh, seriously?
You've got duck, swan, quail, wood pigeon, goose, grouse, moorhen, crane, heron. They're fishing. You have eel, roach, salmon, cod and bass. And that's just Glastonbury Lake Village. Over in East Anglia, again, where areas get marshy and boggy, and you've got the fens. There again is a very small percentage of where it is boar and deer. But there's things like Dalmatian pelicans being hunted. There's swan. Swan actually makes up an impressively sizable amount of the bones found of the butchered animals. Heron is a real key one, and let alone food. We mustn't forget that they are hunting animals like otter and beaver and martins, foxes, most predominantly for their fur. What I always love is amongst all of these, you have these numbers and all these animals, and then you still find hedgehog amongst it as well.
Well, the Romans liked hedgehog, didn't they?
The Tudors as well.
As well. But when you encounter things like red deer, I think Danebury Hillfort. It's usually quite hard to ascertain how much deer they were eating, because a lot of the samples go upon antlers, and of course deer shed their antlers, so it could have just been collected. But when there's the red deer bones found at Danebury Hillfort, they're not all those red deer bones come from one animal, and the animal hasn't been butchered. The animal's been laid in a grave like you would a pet. And next to it, there's also a bird, potentially a crow or a raven, a corvid type bird, again in a grave, not butchered, nothing like that, The deer, I think it
fawn,
shows
isn't
signs
it?
that on its leg, it's a fawn, it's died young, and one of its legs seems like it had an injury. So maybe someone's been out on the track, come across an injured deer that's been abandoned, brought it home as a pet or whatnot. It's
my
died,
goodness.
and the family has buried it like you would a pet.
Wow.
And cats.
Wow.
Just
Cats.
amazing.
Cats too.
Cats.
Oh, wow.
are
Okay.
You've got
very rare in
wild
Iron Age
cat.
kitten. No, I
wild
mean
cat.
kittens. You know
Oh,
the
kittens. Sorry,
there's
yeah.
a find of kittens. Well, I
Oh.
mean, not butchered, by the way. Sorry, I shouldn't.
Okay,
really-
yeah.
Okay. That is interesting. Okay. No, I had no idea.
But the
That's
otter,
fascinating.
otters and beavers are much more predominant in the wild animals hunted than I thought earlier on.
Amazing.
And I have to say, beaver, the fact that their tail is mainly a reserve of fats for the winter
Yeah.
is very interesting. The fur, obviously,
Yeah.
possibly the teeth for making tools and things like that.
Yeah.
But the potential glands of castor oil
Yes.
could have been used as well. There's only very little
How
evidence of
interesting.
butchery
Okay.
for the tail. It's
That's
complicated.
fascinating. That is fascinating.
But in essence, there's not a lot of hunting. Though, if you go up to Scotland, for example, you might on some times go up from 5 to 20% of the
Yeah.
butchered
Yeah,
animals.
yeah.
The increase is
Yeah.
quite high, and when you get to the coast, on the coast as well, collection of shellfish
Absolutely.
increases as
yes.
well. But
Yeah.
regardless of where you are, generally speaking, it's agriculture and farmed animals,
Yeah.
and generally with sheep as the primary source. However, of course, there's always the exceptions. I mean, there's some hill forts in Wales where cattle form about 64%
Yeah.
of the domesticated
That's
animal
amazing.
bones. And those ones, they seem to be, again, also being slaughtered at quite a young age. They're and fairly regularly culling them
Yeah.
and eating veal and eating calves, basically. So there's always exceptions. There's always differences. But as we say, hunting is, unless you're in very specific places, hunting's a very small part.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even then, when you are hunting, it's not what we think.
You're giving us a wealth of information. This is absolutely fascinating stuff.
I was just going to say, no, I'm just conscious of time romping on, and it's extraordinary actually the wealth of stuff that we can learn so much from the Iron Age from recorded history.
Yeah.
Largely thanks to the Romans, obviously, but that can also inform us so much about what went before.
Well, I was just about
which
to
is-
say, that Caroline and Thomas is essentially being experimental archaeologists.
Yeah.
How do you think? Do you think doing what you do can give you a telescope? To further back in time, or is there a boundary? Is there a big shift from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age? Are you conscious of that? Have you been made aware of that at all?
It depends on the time periods, but it depends on the crafts as well.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know the start of anything about flint knapping, for example.
Yeah.
Bronze Age, bronze working and bronze casting is very similar in techniques to what will be,
Sure.
even happening in the 21st century, apart from modern equipment. So that could have been transferable. Unfortunately for blacksmiths and people working iron, they don't have a choice either.
Yeah, there's no choice there. But what's interesting on that, again, with saying about waste, about the saw being repaired and things like that, again, there's things as simple as war clubs, wooden war clubs found on the continent. Something that we would think is a peasant weapon, a low status weapon, but these ones in particular show particular maybe sentimental value because they've snapped, and instead of just carving yourself a new one, they've actually splintered and bound the handle back up with leather and rawhide to continue using it.
Right,
They haven't
that's
just chucked it
interesting.
away.
Yeah.
Now, how long that splint would have lasted is another matter altogether.
Entirely, yeah.
But they're not, as I say, they're still a wooden item which you would think they'd be able to easily harvest and create a new one. They're still treating it with care
that's very
and
interesting,
reusing
isn't
it.
How often has that been observed? Do you know?
I couldn't give you a number on that one.
But it's certainly, but it's multiple.
It's certainly enough to make it not
that's
a one-off.
fascinating.
There's a few of them across. I think it's mostly what is now Germany, and southern Denmark as well.
Wow.
Certainly as well, if you take things like the numbers that they think fought at things like the Battle of Tolland Bridge, the number of war clubs that certainly look like baseball bats, and then ones that look like typical hammers that you would use. It must have been more of a common practice. There must have been more. And still useful, still something that you would take with you as something you believe is going to protect you in a fight or a skirmish against opposing forces. So it's got value in it, despite it not being bronze.
I think there are limits for us to go back in time, but there are clearly things that apply. We always say humanity didn't change in 10,000 years. The things that you observe with your family, your friends, your neighbors, your village life or town life really nowadays is exactly the same as in so many different time periods. There is a very interesting change in the Bronze Age for me regarding private property, the development of that idea of private property, and suddenly you have more smaller houses, more personal, more family-sized houses, not great big halls to host probably extended family or several of them. And it arrives with an awful lot of problems as well. The development of swords that are clearly one of the only items that are designed to fight, to kill people, with no other use, whereas a bow, an arrow, you can hunt with it, etc. So to me, that would be the limits. I'm not sure for the moment that I can go past that point of view, though it would be extremely interesting for me, and that's why we would like to go back in time, at least to the Bronze Age, just to see a little bit how different it is. They still use pottery, they still cook in the same way, and they still have hygiene. But what was it? How was it like? So that's a very good question, yes.
That question, how was it like, though? I mean, we've covered a lot of ground, but one thing that just crossed my mind, because I had an image, I was looking at some stuff in Francis Pryor's book, and there's a gorgeous photograph of an Iron Age house. I mean, I have to call it a house because it's not a hut, it's got a size to it. Exactly. And we haven't sort of talked about the living conditions, the conviviality of it, the atmosphere of it, perhaps. I don't know if you've got any experience of
many,
very good. Thought you might.
We've had some very nice nights and some very cold nights in reconstructed roundhouses. Speak to that a little bit if you can.
I
think one of the things we've realised, having stayed in some fantastic reconstructions across the country, and I mean, we've been on a crannog out on a loch, so a roundhouse on stilts out in the water.
Which loch did you? Was that
Loch Tay? That was.
So that's the Scottish Crannog
Centre. The Scottish Crannog Centre.
The Crannog
Centre. So we've had the chance to stay in there for the night. We've been to Chiltern Open Air Museum, the Ancient Technology Centre. We've had a chance to stay in different roundhouses at different sites, and they're all fantastic reproductions and reconstructions. But I think my biggest thing has always been, because these are only reconstructions, and for the large majority of the time, they're to be looked at and visited, and then you leave. Unless we get a chance, and hey, we're willing for anyone to offer us this chance, to go and live in a roundhouse for an extended period.
And we're talking weeks and months.
Not just
Yes.
not just a week, but months. You make that house comfortable. You sweep it, you clean it, you put fresh bedding down, you sort out the fire, you find out how it works, you work out, you actively repair walls, you repair thatching, you problem solve the problems that come out, and you maintain the house. And that has been the biggest thing. They've been great to stay in, but every roundhouse has been, every reproduction we've been in has, of course, been there for visitors to see, and then they leave. And so there's just that element. You feel that they would be uncomfortable. You would make them comfortable, and you take advantage of it.
I think has been the best furnished house. There's a very good one at Butser Ancient Farm as well, but Castle Henlys was looked incredibly cozy, and that's the thing. We don't have much information about the furniture, and you can't say that Iron Age people, and so Must Farm, honestly, fingers crossed, prove it, go for it. I want a bed. I want a bed, and I want it above the ground. I want shelves, and I want a chair and low tables. Some of them are mentioned in ancient texts, and that's all very well. But you can't say that in Hallstatt culture in Germany, in Hordorf, people can have a mattress, several layers, stuffed, and a pillow and blanket on a bronze couch with wheels to move it, and not be able to make a wooden bed. I don't believe that. You make yourself comfortable. It's not a survival situation. It's a human way of living.
Yeah. Well, it's very telling, isn't it, when you look at places like, Skara Brae is probably our best example, that you go right back to the Neolithic, and you look at their furniture where you've got beds and you've got cupboards, and that there's no reason to think that the furniture would have been any less sophisticated just because it was made from wood everywhere else. So
that's true.
I think that's where the things like the Roman texts start working against us, because in the lack of having the actual archaeological evidence there in the Iron Age, we start listening to people like Julius Caesar or Tacitus talking about the Germans just making a bed by chucking down birch branches and lying on it. Wherever they may be, they just sit on skins and so on and so forth. There's no furniture in the house. Okay, well, at what point did we suddenly go, you know what, that bed, it's not for me? You might like it, but it's just not how I do things. So one other thing for me is thatch on the houses. It's always done from a modern perspective. It's always twice as thick as what it's believed it would have been, and so it creates these incredibly smoky houses when we stay in them. Whereas you compare it to even round houses in African tribes, in villages there, and the thatch is half as thick. You put it on a steeper pile, a steeper angle, rain still runs off, it doesn't leak through, and the smoke stays comfortably above your head. You don't spend your time in the smoke as much. And so there's still work to be done, there's still experiments to be done with the houses. It's not so much just about building them. I think it's now we've got to start looking at how to make them livable, what we needs to be tweaked to actually go past just the achievement of making them. Go past that achievement, because we know that roughly now. Must Farm has really revealed how the beams would have been sitting, holding up the houses. That's what we've been missing all these years as well. And I think we've got a fairly good grasp of how some of these houses would be built. There's still theory going on, but now we need to look at how we think they were still living in it, go beyond it, and now we've got to live in them, test that bit out.
And that might be one of the limits of experimental archaeology as well, because we have 21st century people, we have 21st century health and safety regulations and limitations, and of course they have been
it's so utterly inappropriate in this context, isn't it?
It's a very complex, if you start looking at open air museum and replica houses and things like that, it's very complex. But to live in such a way, even my favorite experiment, surviving the Iron Age, that has been done 20 years ago at Castle Henlys, it was really well thought since the start, really well made, but the hygiene side of things, for example, had to be tweaked because we have 21st century medicine and some people needed it because because women have monthly issues with that as well. And that's something that they didn't want to experiment with. It wasn't the point, really. And I want to know about that because as soon as you start lifting a stone, everything makes sense. If you have a clean fireplace, you have clean wood ash, you can make lye outside. If you have lye, you can bleach things. If you can, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But will we be able to do that for a comfortable period of time? I mean, we're offering our good selves.
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone has any ideas, by all means.
Tell us, how can people find out more about what you do and where you are and all of that?
Yeah.
Oh, well, online websites. We have both. Each of us have a website. So myself as Archaeological, and Thomas as Big Bainan's Blacksmithing. Yeah. And the usual Facebook, Instagram.
Mm-hmm. We'll be nice. We'll drop some links into the
we
will. We'll put
the website page.
How very Iron Age.
Otherwise, meeting people on events, unfortunately not for the moment, but displays and courses really are the best. I learn so much from people I meet and just chat to because they have visited some place or seen something. Just exchanging, really.
It's been so exciting talking to you two. It really has.
Really has.
A terrific wealth of information. I'm sure everybody will have really enjoyed listening to you.
Well,
thank you both so very much. I think that's time to draw this podcast to a close. Slowly but surely.
Yes, I would like to say though that I very much look forward to meeting up with you guys, doing what you do somewhere, which I guess all of us can say that it's probably going to be next year now. But but even so, there is so much to learn from what you do. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks to you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
It was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, listeners, for listening, and we'll see you all next time.
We'll see you next time. Yeah.
Bye for now.